All right. Good morning. Good morning. Let's everybody find our seats here. And we'll get started here. Hebrews chapter 11. Last week, let me start further back. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Hebrews chapter 10 and how at the end of chapter 10, it's like a door that swings on a hinge. And so in chapters 1 through chapter 10, the first part of the book, the author of Hebrews has been exploring the identity and the character and the purpose of Christ, the purpose of his deity, the purpose of his humanity. And so he's been, and the meaning of Jesus' death on the cross for our sins and how he conquered death in the resurrection. The author's been talking about how Christ, how Jesus is the priest for all of humanity, that he stands in to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves because we are compromised human beings. We are not perfect. We all make mistakes, and so we don't have the right to stand in front of God ourselves. We can only do that through Jesus. And so the last 2 weeks we came to this hinge in the book in chapter 10. And the author gets in our face and he says, if this is in fact who Jesus is, and this is what he's done, the question is, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond to that? And the door swings then from just telling a historical story to the final chapters 11, 12, and 13. And the author is challenging us to respond. No. Stop. Be still. You too. The author is challenging us to respond. And so what are we going to do? What is the appropriate response to this reality of who Jesus is, this divine human priest who has offered us his life in love? He's offered it for our forgiveness, for the remaking of our hearts. You, go sit over here. Thank you. He's offered it for the remaking of our hearts. This is not, we talked about last week how that response that we should be giving is faith. And that faith is based on Jesus' resurrection, right? Remember that example of the crocus flower? Last week we said that even though there's still snow on the ground in some places, there's crocus flowers blooming. And Jeanette asked if I had actually seen one. And yes, I saw one at AC in the flower shop. I don't know if that counts or not.
No,
doesn't count. It's not in the ground yet. But Jesus being resurrected is like the crocus flower. It's the first one that blooms when spring comes. Even though it's going to snow again, and even though it's going to get cold again, we go out with our shirt sleeves on and our flip-flops because we're ready for summer. We want summer to come, right? But faith is not just a belief in our brain, right? Remember James chapter 2 and verse 22. He says that you see that faith is working with works. That as a result of works, your faith was perfected. And so that's going to lead to the two major points that I'm going to try and make this morning. That our faith is based on facts, and that our faith is completed. Our faith is perfected by obedience. Those are the 2 points. Our faith is based on facts, and that our faith is perfected by obedience. And so, think about the early Christians. Think about the very first Christians, right? That their faith was built on a series of facts, right? That was a big deal to Paul, right? That in in 1 Corinthians, we read from there this morning during the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 now. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verses 1 through 2. He says, "Now I want to make clear for you, brothers and sisters, the gospel I preached to you, which you received, and on which you have taken a stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold to the message I preached to you, unless you believed in vain." Do you see that the reality of our faith is built on the truthfulness of the thing that we put our faith in, right? See, the focus of our faith is not actually on our being able to just drum up more belief. What's much more important is the reality, is the foundation of our faith. Is it trustworthy? Can we trust the foundation of our faith? Jesus is the exact imprint. That's Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. Let me go back there real quick. Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, the exact expression or copy or representation, the exact representation of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. And so Jesus is the reality of God's hypostasis. We talked about that last week, that Greek word. Exact nature, exact being of God. And this writer, he wants us to see that the focus of our faith, that Jesus is real. He is an objective reality. He's not a wish. He's not a hope, right? He is the full reality of God revealed to us. This is why we're confident, right? It's what he did. It's not our performance, right? It's not whether or not I can do enough. It's not whether or not I can be good enough. This is about what Jesus did for us. And so our faith is real, right? God has become man. Everybody saw him. Everybody saw the cross. Everybody saw the resurrection. Everybody sees who he is and what he did, that he is the priesthood for us, that he is our sacrifice. And so our faith then demonstrates the existence of reality. Do you see how this is not just a belief, something that I can just drum more up of? Jesus is the objective reality of God. He is the proof of God. Jesus is the object. He is the basis of our faith. He is the evidence for our faith. I want you to look at this picture here. Look at this. Can you see it? Yeah, you can see it. If you're sliding down a cliff, think of this cartoon guy, right? You're sliding down a cliff. Are you going to be thinking, and you grab onto this branch, are you thinking, man, I wish that I could hope that I could hold on tight enough? Is that what you're putting your hope in? Or you got this little branch in your hand, what are you hoping? That the branch can hold you, right? That's exactly it. And so are you going to sit down and make a calculation on these sorts of things? On your strength and the radius of your fingers as they're closed and how much force it's going to take? No, it matters what the strength is of the thing that you're grabbing onto. And that's what Paul is getting at. And that's what the author of Hebrews here is getting at. And so he says, here it is. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians 15. Verses 3 through 8 now. That I passed on to you as most important, of first importance, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then the 12, and then he appeared to over 5,000 brothers and sisters at one time, Most of them are still alive, but some of them have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, and then all to the apostles. And last of all, as to one born at the wrong time, he appeared to me. Do you get any sort of idea here that faith in the gospel is about mustering up some sort of religious experience? I believe, I believe, I believe. Is that what he's talking about? He's talking about facts here. Our faith is rooted in historical testimony about what actually happened. And so sometimes we might ask, are these eyewitnesses reliable? Can we trust these people? That is a very valid question. Is that eyewitness testimony that finds its way into our Bibles, into our New Testament, can we trust it? How can I know that it's true? And you want to poke and you want to prod, some of us do. And I want to say that's great. That is something that is very good. It's great that we are asking questions, that you're asking questions. It's not a sign that you're lacking faith. Questions are not a sign that you are lacking faith. It is a sign that you are actually growing, though, that you're engaging with your faith, that you want to find answers, right? If you struggle with doubts, if you struggle with questions, I want to encourage you that that is okay. But we need to be responsible about how we find answers for those things. Do we go to the person with the crystal ball who's been convicted of fraud 5 times? Miss Cleo. I don't know if you're old enough to remember. Miss Cleo and the telephone number. You call on the TV. She was a fraudster. So if you struggle with doubts, that's okay. But we need to find ways to answer those doubts and find ways to move towards those doubts in ways that are responsible, to poke, to prod, to engage with our faith and those doubts. We need to be like Abraham and Sarah. We need to engage our mind, not in the sense of just saying, oh, I just need to say I believe more. That's not what Abraham and Sarah did, right? That we need to probe the truthfulness of what God has done for Christ, that it can stand the test. Our truthfulness can stand the test. The Bible stood the test for more than 2,000 years. Yeah, thanks for coming, buddy. And so for years now, things might be much more complex than we first thought, right? If we have questions about the Bible, they might be more complex. They might be more complex than the answers that you received in Sunday school. Not trying to denigrate any Sunday school teacher, but we often give simple answers to kids so they can understand them. But if we don't ever move on and poke and prod and get the more complex answer to get the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey says, right? Then we won't know the rest of the story. Oh, a lot of people do. I know Paul Harvey. He was still on the radio when I was young. And that's okay that you didn't get all the answers when you were growing up. But reality is complex. God is complex. But you don't have to be afraid, is my point. You need to engage. That's a sign of an active faith. And according to Hebrews here, engaging with your mind, faith begins with engaging your mind and with reason, with logic. And so, if we flip back to Hebrews chapter 11 and ask ourselves, is Hebrews chapter 11 a chapter about people who sit around and read apologetics books about how to counter the latest argument of evolution? and then they write this big long thesis about how it's wrong. I wouldn't say so, right? Not that those things are necessarily bad in themselves, but just that that's not what we're talking about here when we say you need to engage your faith. The primary example of faith in Hebrews chapter 11 is people who are living radically, in a radical obedience to the teachings of God and to the covenant of Jesus, to the covenant of God prior to Jesus as well. So, let's look at verse 8 in Hebrews chapter 11. Well, let's read verse 7. Read about Noah as well. By faith, Noah, after he was warned about what was not yet seen, and motivated by godly fear, sat around and said, I believe, I believe, I believe. I have faith. God's going to save me. I have faith. No, it says he built an ark to deliver his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and set out for a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. He went out, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he stayed as a foreigner in the land of promise, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, co-heirs of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Looking forward to that new Jerusalem. So faith here is linked to actions and obedience. By faith, Abraham did what? He went out. He settled in this new land where he had no relatives. He didn't know anybody. Faith here is not linked necessarily with thinking. Faith is linked with obedience. Faith here is linked to action and obedience. Actions, it's linked to actions and obedience, and those actions and obedience don't make a lot of sense. Doesn't make a lot of sense if you're living 4,000 years ago to move to a land where you don't know anybody and you can't provide for your family as well, because you don't know how to live there. You have to figure it all out. Do you see that Abraham's obedience only makes sense if God's promises are true? It only makes sense if God is going to be faithful to those promises. It's only through that lens of faith that Abraham's behavior makes all the sense in the world. Right? He's going to go to this land because God is going to give it to him, to his descendants. But does he have proof of that? Does he have a deed for the land? No. No, but he can reason. He can use his mind to reason that God has been faithful so far in his life and to his father and to his father. But this is where faith becomes a leap, right? We say take a leap of faith. And a lot of times we mean that to mean a blind leap, right? But this is not, Abraham didn't take a blind leap, right? His eyes were wide open. He says that I reason that God is faithful, and now I'm being asked to make this hard decision. Am I going to act in a way that doesn't make sense in light of my culture? Am I going to act in a way that doesn't make sense in light of my current circumstances, but is the way that God wants me to act? This is where faith becomes that leap of faith. But this is not a blind leap, it's an informed leap. It's informed by whether or not God is faithful or not. That's what's happening here. And so what is Abraham doing? Is he going to move his whole family out into the wilderness in the middle of this land? where he doesn't have any relatives. That makes about as much sense as people walking around in February in flip-flops and t-shirts as soon as it hits 40, just like today, right? It's like, what? Why would you do that, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense, but I do it anyway. I'm one of those people. Because we know winter is still here. This is Alaska, right? That's how it works. And of course it doesn't make any sense if you believe that winter is forever. But if you see the crocus flower that's blooming, you know that sunny and 65 is coming. Then your behavior all of a sudden makes all the sense in the world. And that, in my mind, is the beginning of what obedience is. An obedient faith in the New Testament. That's what it is. It's not just that God's joy that he somehow gets joy out of telling people what to do. That's not what he gets joy out of. He doesn't give joy out of giving us a whole bunch of rules. That's not what's going on. Are you going to do it? There's a checklist right here. And if you don't, I got a lightning bolt right here. That's not what God does. That is a gross distortion of what God is and what's happening. The whole point of what Hebrews is saying is that the crocus flower has bloomed in Jesus, in the resurrection of Jesus, that death has been conquered, and God is taking our world somewhere. He's moving it towards renewal and restoration that we have this picture of in Revelation 21. The new Jerusalem coming down out of the clouds to meet us in the sky. He's moving us towards renewal and restoration by including us in the kingdom. That when Jesus returns, he's going to make all things right. It's called justice, when somebody makes things right. That's really where this future is headed. And it makes all the sense in the world then for us to act rightly if that is the truth, if that is what we have ahead of us. Why would I refuse to forgive? Just as an example, why would I refuse to forgive? It's one of Jesus' most well-known teachings, right? Love your enemies. Bless those who persecute you. Forgive us because you have been forgiven. Right? Why? Why would you do that? Why would you release them from obligation to you, from debt to you? Why would you pray for somebody and bless somebody who has hurt and wounded you deeply? Why would you do that? Well, because of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. I know that one day all things are going to be reconciled and made right. And all wrongs are going to be made right. All debts are going to be forgiven. All relationships are going to be restored if they're able to be restored. That's where this world is going. And it makes absolutely no sense for me to not forgive if that is the course of where this world is going. But on the other hand, if you live in the world and you trust in the world, of course it makes all the sense in the present not to forgive this person, because that's all you have. Because this world is all about get yours and what belongs to you. And you're going to get what's coming to you, right? Don't tread on me. Of course, those sorts of ideas make sense when you're living in the winter. and you don't see the crocus flower. You don't see what is ahead of us. Don't tread on me, because I'm going to tread on you if you do. But that behavior makes no sense once the summertime comes. Because what that means for us is that obedience is about living in the present. Obedience is about living in the present as if the future has already arrived. Obedience is about living in the present as if the future is here. This is not a blind faith. You're doing it because you can point back to the evidence of the risen Jesus and the testimony about the risen Jesus. Faith is not a blind acceptance of tradition either. The good news of the New Testament, the gospel, makes certain claims about what kind of world that we're living in. It makes claims about the events that took place in Jesus' life that have cosmic significance, worldwide, throughout the entire universe. And you can choose to ignore those claims if you want to, but I think you'd be foolish to ignore them. You can choose, on the other hand, to probe and discern and poke and prod to see if those claims are really true. And if you decide that they are reasonable claims, that they are truthful claims, that changes everything this author of Hebrews here is telling us. That changes everything. It changes how we need to look at our relationships. It changes our finances. It changes our sex life. It changes our work. It changes our vocation in life. It reframes all of that, because all of those things in our life are going to be a part of where God is taking this world. Am I going to choose to live perpetually in the winter of going out and taking what belongs to me, and don't tread on me because I'm going to get you back even harder? Am I going to live like that? Am I going to perpetually live in winter? Even though the crocus flower has already bloomed, that we can see something better has already blossomed. People who refuse to recognize that flower and what it represents, they choose to live in winter, even when summertime is on its way. They choose to remain trapped in a life of unfaith and unbelief. This is the power, really, of Hebrews chapter 11. And so it might speak differently to you than it does to me. But at the end of the day, faith, its begins with engaging our mind. It begins with obeying by faith. It begins with real events that happened. It begins with living as if the future has really arrived with the beginning. That is Jesus' resurrection. With that, the future has arrived. And when we do that, when we live like that, when we actually forgive, when we actually reorient our life and how we think about sex, how we think about money and relationships, and we begin to obey the teachings of Jesus and align our life with that, it's like we actually begin to taste the reality that we're hoping for. We get that taste of summer, of 40-degree weather, of seeing that flower. We get a taste of the new creation, right? When we're able to master our bodily impulses and our bodily temptations that are telling us to do all sorts of things that would ruin our life. But we can choose Jesus. We can be headed towards restoration and self-control and whole, healthy relationships. Because that's where this world is going. We often talk about the destruction of the world in a negative sense. This is about the construction of the world in a positive sense. We're headed towards restoration and self-control and healthy relationships because we can taste the reality of the new creation in the present, right now. I think that's what the author means when he says, faith is the substance that we hope for. That when you obey by faith, you experience the future, the reality of what is true. There might be some of us here who, maybe we haven't made that decision yet to be a Christian. And my challenge to you would be to consider the claims of the gospel. We're not gathering around some sort of superstition here, right? I said last week, if that was the case, I would have checked out a long time ago. I promise you. We're coming around this gospel message of Jesus being buried and being raised from the dead because we're convinced it's actually true, right? If Jesus, in fact, if Jesus rose from the dead, then this world is a lot different. It's a lot stranger than you thought it was when you woke up this morning, right? There are things that are possible and things that are true that maybe you didn't know could be true or possible. And so the challenge for us would be for you to consider this truth that's being proclaimed here in chapter 11, that has been a door that has swung open now. These things are true. Now what will you do? How will you respond? Are you willing to stand up now and put Christ on in faith? Washing away your sins in baptism. Are you willing to do that? If we call ourselves Christians, right, and Hebrews 11 really delivers a punch to our gut. Right? And here's how I think I'd put the question. I would say, for those of us who do claim to be Christians and have been baptized, I would ask, can you identify an area in your life that makes no sense? Using the world's reasoning. Can you identify an area that, or a behavior, or an obedience that makes no sense in light of your present circumstances in the world? Are you wearing the flip-flops and t-shirt in the 40-degree weather, crunching through the snow? Is there some area in your life that can only be explained by faith? And that can only be explained by where God is taking this broken world of forgiveness? Is there an area of our finances? Is there an area of our generosity? In our relationships? Do our lives show the marks of this radical faith, of this radical commitment to Jesus? Can I think of one area of my life where I'm following with that risky, radical faith? Not an ignorant or blind faith, but a risky, radical faith. I would put to you that if you cannot think of an area in your life, you need to reconsider your actions in your life. Because risky, radical faith is taking a step, but taking a step by considering God's faithful in doing something that doesn't seem so normal right now. By forgiving somebody who maybe doesn't deserve it. Air quotes, right? But those sorts of actions will seem normal in the new creation, in the new Jerusalem, the new city with foundations that God has built. Abraham was hoping for, right? Is our life exemplified by that sort of faith and that faithful obedience that, like Abraham, would take up everything that we have and go do something that makes no sense to anybody else around them? It only makes sense because of God's fulfilling promises. We need to take those radical steps in our own lives. And that's the lesson from Hebrews chapter 11 this morning about a radical faith. It's based on facts, but it's also based on obedience. That's what this whole chapter has been about. We haven't gone through every example, but I encourage you to look at these examples. Every single one of these people did something that makes no sense. Rahab welcomed spies. The penalty for doing that is death. But she welcomed spies because she had faith. Are we doing something that makes no sense to anybody else around us, but only makes sense because of what God has promised to do for us? If not, we need to take those radical steps in our life to reorient our life to being in line with Christ. Next week, we'll look at chapter 12. Once we have made that decision, we need to endure. That's what chapter 12 is all about. It's good to see everybody here this morning. We'll see you all next week. Jeanette?